Hi, this is Roberta Chevret, your professor of critical methods in communication. And this lecture will offer an overview of the first specific method that we'll be diving into this semester, which is cluster criticism. Cluster criticism, as presented in your textbook, draws heavily from the work of Kenneth Burke, who was a prominent literary theorist and rhetorical thinker working in the mid 1900s. Kenneth Burke wrote many books trying to explain the important role of rhetoric and language in shaping human thought and behavior. Burke essentially saw all language as rhetoric. And we've talked before about all words being symbols, insofar as words always refer to something outside of itself. So this is a glass, but we've just given it that name. And what Burke's observation was that when we use language, we're essentially engaging in an act of cooperating with others and in engaging others in some kind of response. So that may not be that obvious with a word like glass, although you automatically know that that's something you can drink out of, or it's something that's breakable. There's actually quite a few meanings that attach even to such a simple term. So when you take that concept and use it to think about these more powerfully persuasive uses of language in our society, then there's a lot to unpack there, and cluster criticism is a means of helping us do this. For Burke, similar to your textbook's definition of rhetoric as being something that is essentially human, Burke saw this as what fundamentally made humans different from other animals, that humans were the symbol using animal, and Burke was fond of saying also the symbol misusing animal. Burke's concern was with how does rhetoric influence our attitudes and our actions? And one really exemplary work of Burke's that demonstrates these interests is his analysis of a speech of Hitler's, or actually it's of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. And Burke completed this in 1939. And I'll talk a little bit about that on our next slide. But essentially, one of the central claims and ideas behind cluster criticism is that the words we use, the things we say, are how we name and define the world. And that those names and definitions have really significant impacts, and they command certain responses from an audience. So, in Burke's analysis of Hitler's Mein Kampf, Burke identified several tropes in Hitler's rhetoric in this book. So, the English translation is My Struggle. And the themes that Burke found, which is why I've also indicated in your syllabus that when we talk about cluster criticism, in many ways we're talking about something that's often called thematic analysis, that you're looking for the themes regarding how language and symbols are used within a particular artifact. Okay, so going back to the artifact of Mein Kampf, the themes that Burke found is one, that Hitler presented a common enemy throughout the use of language, we, they, us, them. And this common enemy became the symbol of evil against which the German people were to unite. So the common enemy trope promotes the cohesion of a social body through antithesis or its opposite. So uh, Democrats are like this, Republicans are like that. We don't do that. That's a form of creating a common enemy, the way that a lot of our partisan discussions occur along these lines of us, them. Another thing that Burke found was what he called geographical materialization, and essentially that Hitler's writings presented Munich as the center of authority, or essentially as the center of everything that mattered, the center of the world, really. There was also the use of the unifying voice. Unifying voice is something that we're likely to find in a lot of political artifacts, especially in times of struggle, but presenting the nation as one and unifying them. Actually, you can find the use of unifying voice in a lot of COVID-19 era commercials that talk about how we're getting through this together. Another thing found in Mein Kampf was the use of projection devices. So essentially scapegoating that personalizes these threats that the common enemy symbolizes. So in this case, Hitler's use of projection devices scapegoated all of Germany's and the working white Aryan people in Germany, scapegoated their struggles onto the Jewish population, making Jewish people the threat to the German people through the use of rhetoric. Another theme that was found was inborn dignity. So here, the idea is that the ideal German citizen is heroic, noble, dignified, kind of just glorious, all the wonderful things about humanity, and others are presented as subhuman versus this kind of inborn dignity that came in Hitler's writing by simply being born an Aryan citizen of Germany on German soil. Tying back to that idea of geographical materialization. Another theme was that of symbolic rebirth. So essentially, Hitler made an, at the time, very convincing argument to the German people that if they eliminated this scapegoat, the common enemy target population, that they would once again rise with the dignity that they were born into, and the nation would rise as one. And then finally, a final theme that Burke identified was the attribution of Germany's economic problems to Jewish moneylenders. And Burke called this commercial use, that essentially here language is being used in this way that rather than recognizing other people as human, instead is scapegoating specifically in relation to the German economy. So in sharing this prominent example of a Burkean thematic analysis with you, I wanted to discuss Hitler's rhetoric because we're all familiar with the consequences of this rhetoric and the devastating consequences of this rhetoric. And what Kenneth Burke saw and identified at that time is that essentially the vocabularies that we use and that we develop, they don't just reflect an existing reality. Instead, they make selections of that reality. They highlight only a certain part of that reality. And in doing so, they deflect and push aside all of these other things. And so they fundamentally alter the ways that we're able to see the world. The term that Burke gave this is terministic screens. And terministic screens describes how terms essentially filter what we see. So we can picture a word as being very similar to a screen door, that when we're looking through a screen door, the light's kind of hazy, shapes are not fully formed, but we have a sense of what we see, but the screen filters it, it shapes it. And terministic screens then they can create very different worlds for their users. So I put an example here that is another controversial example that I'm sure we're all familiar with, and that we position ourselves in relation to these terms, whether we've consciously thought about it or not. And that is the example of pro-life versus pro-choice. These terms don't describe two sides of an already existing reality. These terms also shape how we view that reality. And you can see that in the fact that they're not actually opposites. It's not pro-life versus anti-life. It's not pro-choice versus anti-choice, though each side, of course, would depict the other side in those negative ways. But here we have people fighting for what they see as the most important term or filter. So with the selection of a single term, then we also prioritize other ways of seeing. So pro-life prioritizes seeing the thing that is inside of a woman's body. It emphasizes seeing that as a fully formed human or life from conception. Choice emphasizes a different reality again. It selects a certain part of reality and instead uses other terms like fetus and things that reflect the development of this thing inside a woman's body. So here I'm using the word thing just to highlight that whatever we call it makes a difference, and it maps onto and connects with these other terms. I put here as another example, white nationalists' use of the phrase blood and soil. And the reason I put this as a terministic screen in relation to the previously discussed example of Hitler's rhetoric is that this terminology actually carries over from the construction of the German Aryan sort of nation as based on German blood and rooted in the geographic territory. So that has been adopted by other white nationalist groups as a slogan. Some other terministic screens, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is calling us to select and attend to a particular aspect of reality, in this case with a terministic screen that is highlighting that Black lives have not been taken to matter in various situations and by arms of law enforcement and the criminal justice system in the United States. Murfreesboro Loves, I put as another example here, and this organization started a few years ago, but in 2017, actually, there was a rally in Murfreesboro where white nationalist groups actually came in from surrounding areas, and they did a protest in Shelbyville. That is, the white nationalists did an event in Shelbyville. They didn't really end up showing up in Murfreesboro, but the whole square was fenced off and there was a counter protest, and it was quite the event. And so some local activists got together and they formed their own terministic screen, Murfreesboro Loves, and they wanted to highlight and essentially create a new reality with that word. Their point being that this is not a place for hate groups. And even if we have some issues with racism in the South and in the area of Murfreesboro, that by selecting this term, Murfreesboro Loves, the activists in this organization wanted to also make that a reality through the words we use. There's a link embedded in this slide as well that shows us a quick undergraduate criticism of memes. Now, I'm not sure with the screen share that I have going for you if this is showing up for you, but the link will be there in the downloadable PowerPoint. And the article here, the research that was done, described memes as also these kinds of terministic screens that construct realities. And so I thought that was an interesting example. The work that this undergraduate scholar did is they looked at 2016 election memes of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and they looked at how these memes construct realities for their viewers and impact the identities of the individuals they are depicting and the identities of essentially their followers in relation to them. So one of the key aspects of rhetoric from a Burkean perspective, so we've talked about terministic screens and the importance of words as filtering and impacting our realities. Burke also saw identification as fundamental to the rhetorical process. And you have an exercise related to identification for your discussion post on cluster criticism. Identification looks at how we form our identities, ourselves, through various means. So behind me, for example, I have a unicorn head on the wall. And I think it's a little silly because it's not a, animal that I hunted. It's not a real live animal head, and it's not even a real animal. So it's a unicorn symboling, magical kinds of alternatives. And in some way, even just these objects that we collect, they shape or reflect our own identities. So you could look around your room right now, your house right now, and look at the things you have in it. What do they mean to you? What about the things that you are wearing? And it's not just artifacts that shape our identities, it's also the work that we do, the friends that we have, the activities we enjoy, our faith, our other beliefs and values, and so on. And so from a Burkean perspective, the reason that identification is so important is that it is essentially the human connection that we are separate from one another. And Burke, as well as many philosophical thinkers, have talked about this separation as kind of being the root of a lot of human desires and drives. And so when we identify with other people or with ideas or with objects, we align ourselves with them. And Burke talked about this as the sharing of substance, that essentially in this action, we become consubstantial. As mentioned in the example of the rhetoric of Mein Kampf, identification persuades through commonality, through saying, you know, this group of people is one. We are unified. We are the same in what we like or what we look like, or we're the same in that we don't all look alike. You know, commonality takes a lot of different shapes. We're all pet lovers. We're all students. We're all MTSU people. And then there is antithesis. So having said MTSU people, of course, one place we see antithesis is in sports, where we have our team versus their team. And that's about commonality with the unified group through this kind of antithesis or outside. Another quote from Burke here, then, in unpacking this idea of identification, is that we can't really persuade others or influence others if we can't get them to identify with us. So identification then becomes really key to making any kind of influence. And identification here in this quote is talked about as coming through speech, through tone, through image, ideas, and so forth. All right, so how does this all apply to the method of cluster criticism? So each of the different rhetorical methods in the textbook present a particular way of researching a rhetorical artifact. Cluster criticism, as its kind of key ideas, believes that cues to a rhetor's worldviews can be found through terministic screens. So again, this is the language that they use. Or images can also serve as terministic screens. Clustering is a form of thematic analysis. So it's essentially analyzing a text that is a cultural text or artifact, and it's looking at what themes do you see? What kind of things go together? What oppositions do you see? And as we examine these clusters, we can find out more about how the cultural text or artifact works, sometimes uncovering elements that aren't even conscious to the reader. For cluster criticism, this works well for discursive, that is like verbal or written artifacts, or non-discursive artifacts, such as visual artifacts, as long as they are symbolic. So this does work well for analyzing rhetoric that has a lot of words in it. Some of the examples in the book include a cluster criticism of a bunch of different news stories following Hurricane Katrina. I think it's about a disaster relief and how that was talked about in these news stories. Other examples of non-discursive artifacts in the text include the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is discussed, as well as fire prevention posters, which do contain some words, but also have a lot of images, like Smokey the Bear shows up on all the fire prevention posters, at least in California. Do you have Smokey the Bear here? For cluster criticism, you do need an artifact that's long or complex enough, and it does work well for examining related texts. There are 3 steps of cluster analysis. The first is to identify key terms, or if it's a visual artifact, it could be colors, images, shapes. And the criteria used to identify the key terms is frequency. How often do they show up? How often do they repeat themselves? Or various kind of iterations of the same thing. If I've said pet, dog, river, ball, 5 times, within a page of text, then that might start to emerge as a key term. And the other criteria is intensity. So here it doesn't have to be how frequently things are brought up, but how much is it kind of amplified in the text? Is it, if it's a written text, is it in all caps? Is it exclamation points? Is it really like part of a moving, like a very moving emotional aspect of the text that really like hits you hard? Once you identify the key terms, you then chart clusters of these. So here again, you're looking for things that kind of go, that cluster with them, that act in relation to one another. So you group these essentially into themes. And then you use these clusters to discover an overall explanation for the artifact. Essentially, what that means is that after this kind of close systematic study using this approach, that you are able to explain overall, how does the artifact work? So that's like the process that we went through in the beginning of the lecture using the example of Burke's analysis of Mein Kampf. One piece of advice I have for you for trying out cluster criticism, especially if you've picked an artifact for one of your research papers, if you're doing the shorter ones, or for your long research paper, if you've picked an artifact that cluster criticism might work well with, you can try using a word cloud generator. And I've embedded a link here in the slide. Essentially what a word cloud generator is a place where you can copy and paste and dump a bunch of text into it. And then it will highlight for you what the most repeated terms in the text were. So it won't do anything for the criteria of intensity, but it'll very easily kind of map out in a visual way for you the frequency. So here is a cluster that I did from a Trump press conference at the time I prepared these slides. I didn't write the date down actually of this particular word cloud that I did, but highlighted here are some of the most repeated words in the text. So I'm, said, no, good. And those in and of themselves, they may or may not seem that informative to you. But here it seems to me that I'm is emphasizing Trump's identity. Did I say Trump? Trump's identity. No is also seeming to exemplify Trump's knowledge. And then we can see some of these other related larger terms, things like ballots, deal, plan, can. We see Biden and then a bit smaller Obama. So anyway, these visual word clouds can provide, I think, a helpful tool for doing cluster analysis. All right, so that is our cluster criticism lecture for you, and I hope that you found it useful.